is to Chip Case. Chip, you said, pointing at previous cycles, that monetary policy, policy that the Fed carries out, Ben Bernanke and company, used to be Paul Volcker, used to be Greenspan, basically manipulate the economy by manipulating interest rates that manipulate the housing sector. And that, I think, goes back a little bit to the first point I made when I started out by saying the housing sector and the overall economy are so closely linked. This time, we have the lowest interest rates in history. 3 7/8 on mortgage rates, 0%, what?
We're out of bullets.
I'm sorry?
We're out of bullets.
We're out of bullets. We're about ready to purchase $600 billion worth of Treasury notes. This would seem to suggest that we should all of a sudden, or very soon, see us selling building 1 million to 1.5 million units of housing. It ain't happening this time. Why not?
Well, in part because we used that tool early. We came out before the recession of 2001 with low interest rates. We took the Fed funds rate from 7 down to 2 to 1.5 and to 1, and we pumped a lot of credit in, and we skipped the recession in terms of housing production by doing that. So they very, in some ways, it was very smart. You got out ahead of the curve, but it overdid it. So you had overbuilding. You're not going to get housing starts up and running until you get rid of some of this surplus inventory. There's a lot of stuff out there, and people aren't financing new houses simply because we've got 14.5 million vacant year-round units now. That's a big number. It's not been that high for a long time. It's never been that high, actually. And so it's partially because Greenspan did what he did in 2000, 2001, 2002 to prevent what we knew was going to be a recession. By the time 9/11, I was looking at the figures the other day. You can read the minutes of the Fed. You go back and see what was on their mind at any point in time. I went back and I read the minutes in the spring of 2000, February and March of 2000. They raised the discount rate, and they raised the Fed funds rate to 6.5 in the beginning of 2000. When it got to 2001, things were falling so rapidly that they had to call special meetings. So they raised it in January of 2001. This was before 9/11. January 2001, February 2001, March of 2001. 50 basis points, 50 basis points. They knocked those rates down a tremendous amount. It's 500, 600 basis points. So it was, I think, the reason monetary policy, you can't go below zero. They've thrown everything they have at this, the whole government has. If you think about it, you think of all the subsidy and all the effort we've put into the housing market. We don't tax the income from home ownership. That comes in the form of the services you get living in the house. Despite the fact we don't tax the income, think about buying a house outright. The yield on that investment comes in the form of living in it. And it's not taxable, but despite that fact, we can deduct the money it takes to borrow, and we get to deduct the property tax, and we had this homeowner tax credit. We have Fannie and Freddie buying up paper, and you have the government, the Fed, buying securities, mortgage-backed securities, and putting them on the books of the Federal Reserve Bank. I mean, it's just unbelievable how much we've thrown at this. We've got interest rates at 0. And if you can't get something going at 0, you're not going to get it going.
Let me just follow up a little bit then, not to make you even more pessimistic than you might have been when you walked in the room, or any of you. What I'm hearing from you is we've thrown the kitchen sink at this through monetary policy. We've got interest rates as low as we can, and we're even going to try and get long-term interest rates down, no matter what it might do to inflation, through QE2, the new quantitative easing that was announced last week. So that's not going to work. We elected a gargantuan number of Republicans last week who, if we believe their leadership, their policy, their economic policy appears to be defeat Obama in 12. Do nothing before then except to make it difficult to re-elect him. That pretty pretty much wipes out fiscal policy. So we don't have monetary policy anymore. We don't have any more oomph from monetary policy. Doesn't look like we're going to get much oomph from fiscal policy. Nobody's going to go out there and spend more money. Everybody's worrying about deficit finance. And the bipartisan commission came out today with a plan for lowering government spending by $4 trillion. $4 trillion by 2020. That came out this morning. What are we going to do?
Well, I think we still have an expansive fiscal policy. We're not going to make it any more expansive, right? But we're still running a pretty substantial deficit.
Yeah.
And that means the fiscal policy's there. Monetary policy's flat out. And so I think at this point, you try to deal with the pain that's out there as best you can. Do some infrastructure that if you can get anything by, you can probably get some of that by, and then you wait for the markets to deal with it. Unless you're not going to have, I don't think there's going to be political will to do much more, and I'm not sure we don't just watch for a while and see what will happen. I think the markets are, I mean, if you look at the numbers, they're not terrible. The aggregate numbers, the unemployment's horrible, the labor market's not responding, but we're not going down. We're coming up. And if you get some wealth effect off the stock market in the last year, who knows? You might see the growth rate go up. But I'm with you. I think it's a very tough period in which to try to figure out what to do. I mean, there's not much more we can do.
Okay. Well, let's open it up.
Actually, I wanted to, if Elise could sort of comment on that in Massachusetts.
Wait for that.
Sorry.
Mike.
Actually, I wanted to see if Elise could comment a little bit on the Massachusetts perspective. If we have massive vacancies in terms of overbuilding throughout the country, what did Massachusetts look like in terms of, what is the excess housing stock in Massachusetts relative to population and relative to households right now? And how has that changed in the last 10 years?
Well, I actually think it should maybe
He commented, so I want to see if you want to
better able to comment on that. But what I would say is we have a real mismatch with respect to housing, right? We have lots of housing out in the suburbs, which is quite large, quite grand often, and being occupied by very small numbers of people. And then we have insufficient housing inside really of 128 that's affordable, and that really hasn't changed. What goes up and down some is whether we have net inflow or net outflow, but most of the net inflow we've had into the Commonwealth has been immigrants and primarily folks who are going to live in more urban areas. So there's a kind of at least from our perspective, a permanent lack of affordable housing near people's jobs, right? So what you see is folks living down in Brockton or Taunton and actually commuting up every day to jobs in Boston, as opposed to having enough affordable housing in Boston proper. The other thing that's beginning to take place is a focus on transit-oriented development, so that people are actually trying to cluster housing around T-stops and other kinds of transit approaches. One of the great challenges is if you work in 128, it's perfectly easy from a transportation perspective to get from Boston to 128 in the morning and back again in the afternoon. But it doesn't work the other way around, right? So it's hard for folks within the city to actually be able to find the kind of transportation they need to be able to push out themselves. For example, live in Brockton but come into the city, they've really got to provide much more of that themselves. The transit that's available is not very useful. I just want to, as well, if I can, to comment on what Chip was saying earlier in response to the question that Barry asked, because I think partly in Massachusetts we're beginning to get some of that right. I think actually we've gotten it quite right, which is really to say there's an awful lot of cash sitting on the sidelines right now, right? People aren't necessarily hiring, but there's lots and lots of corporate cash around. And there's a real focus on what I'll call alternative energy, but I don't really mean that in the very broad sense, because lots of those technologies are early on. But there are a lot of little sub-pieces of that. There's energy storage through flywheel and battery. There's material science as it relates to energy conservation. There are improvements in solar panels. There are all kinds of things like that. And I guess if I were sort of trying to think about where you would really find growth and how you would actually generate private sector growth and get private sector capital into it, I would sort of declare a Manhattan Project about alternative energy. And again, not in the broadest sense, because lots of folks know us losing their shirt in that market, but really kind of focusing it on particular arenas. You could focus on that, you could focus on biotech, which of course we've also done here in Massachusetts, and really try and generate the entrepreneurial side of the private sector and fund a lot of that through private sector dollars. There's still a lot of venture money around, there's a lot of corporate money, and one of the reasons it's sitting on a balance sheet is because nobody can figure out what to invest it in, right? I mean, what I'm hearing about in terms of investments that actually provide returns is sort of a variant of what I'm doing, in which people are buying up portfolios of houses for 20%, right? 20 cents on the dollar, and therefore achieving maybe a 12% return off of it. That maybe clears some stuff, but it doesn't actually create the sort of growth that I think ultimately is really necessary to cause the economy to grow. So I think that's a big piece of it. And I think the other piece that I would focus on, if I'd been gone, I think what I would have done early on is to take Citibank and take Bank of America, strip out their bad stuff. So this is really sort of right after Obama came into office. And then send them back out to lend as kind of a shadow of their former selves, but really with a more robust balance sheet. As it is, the large banks are having a very difficult time providing any kind of credit because of what's on their balance sheets. And I think unless we can get the credit issues going, nothing is really going to get going for a good while.
Barry, you might want to throw some in. Your report had some terrific numbers on units and what happened to the colleges and the number of graduates. So, I mean, I'll just say one thing really quickly. It's surprising. You look back at this crisis and we said, well, it's not going to happen nationally because the regions behave so differently one from another. New England did terribly in the last recession back in 1999 and 1990 and 89. And then it did, the recession before that, it did great. It wasn't in bad shape at all. Now we have the big problems in Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and a lot of these places that have just massive numbers of foreclosures and vacant properties and neighborhoods going down. So I think if you take the broad brush and look at Massachusetts, it's in pretty good shape. It's got excess inventory. If you looked at it in abstract and without looking at the rest of the country, it wouldn't look so good. But relative to the rest of the country, it's not a bad situation.
Let me just add just a minute on this. First of all, I think our homeowner vacancy rates now are down around 2% in Greater Boston. Our rental vacancy rates are below 6%.
Yeah,
We're at normal
they're,
markets.
They're 10, 11.
That's right. They're 10, 11. We're at
rental.
6. So we are doing considerably better. This is really quite an extraordinary economy, and it also probably had something to do with the fact that we voted differently than all the rest of the country, thanks to a few people in this room, by the way. The fact of the matter is that the rental market has been one that has really captured our interest this last year, because trying to figure out here, yeah, we're doing better than the rest of the country. We still had an unemployment rate that was over 9%, it's still at 8.4%. That's not a good economy. Why is it that rents today are only 2% below their all-time peak? How can that be, right? Shouldn't rents have fallen? And they've fallen much more in other parts of the country. We've suggested there are 3 reasons for it. One, demand for rental housing has risen because of the foreclosures. People who lose their homes, 900 to 1,000 a month in Greater Boston, most of them are not homeless. Some move in with relatives. Most of them move into rental housing. So they're now putting extra pressure on the rental housing market. The second is these very low sales numbers that Chip talked about suggest that there are a lot of people who in normal times would be moving from rental to home ownership. You know, young couples with kids getting ready to buy that first home, or young couples without kids, or young individuals. They're not doing that anywhere near as rapidly as they did. They're staying in rental housing, which would normally turn over to a new group of people. So that puts pressure on it. But what's really special, it turns out, and we did a lot of work on this, is that we have a built-in rental stabilization program. It's called you guys. It's called, well, the students in the class here. We have 336,000 post-secondary students in Greater Boston. 336,000 of them. Give you an idea, the total population of the city of Boston is 640,000, right? That's a huge number. It also happens to be true that while we're housing about half of our undergraduates on campus, we're building a new dorm, we're closing closing in on 50%, BU's over 50%, BC is over 50% of the undergraduates. The fastest growing population are the enrolled students in this class, graduate students. We actually had as many new graduate students in Greater Boston between 2001 and 2009 as undergraduates. And over the next decade, while the undergraduate population is supposed to grow by 12%, the graduate population will grow by 20%. And why is that so important to the housing market? We only house 7.8% of the graduate students on university or college housing, which means they're all in the market competing with everybody else. So we have these wonderful immigrants coming here and migrants coming here. This is good news for us, and it's part of the reason why Massachusetts is doing so well. We have tremendous brain power coming here from other places. But it does put tremendous pressure on the rental market.
The ownership market and the rental market are also connected on the supply side, and it's been very different from cycle to cycle. If you go back to '90, we were converting everything, right? We were pulling
From
stuff out
rental
of the
to
rental
condo.
stock and turning them into condos because there was an ownership boom. And so that depleted the stock. Every unit you took out of the rental stock made that market tighter at the same time as we were doing this overbuilding of condos. This time it's not doing that because what we're doing, in fact, is taking a lot of condos and turning them into rental units.
Yeah.
So the supply sides are connected in ways that make things seem differently.
Well, if we didn't see that happening, we would have actually seen rents rising
Yeah,
during
that's
this
right.
period of time, despite the weak economy. Question all the way up here.
Thank you.
Could you tell us who you are also?
Dave Holbrook.
And where are you from, Dave?
Work at Eclipses Corporation.
Wonderful. Welcome.
On my way over here tonight, I heard on the radio that there was a suggestion by the Deficit Reduction Commission eliminating the housing interest deduction. Could you speak on the effect that would have on the already suffering market?
Let me do that will it's inconceivable that will happen. It comes up every 3 or 4 years. Under Bush, there was a tax reform commission that suggested it. There was the first draft of the '86 Tax Reform Act had it coming out. But what happens is the minute you mention it, the following people get together: the National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Realtors, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Bankers Association. They come together like they have a red button on their desk. And when somebody mentions the homeowner deductions, they push it, and it dies. And now they are smaller organizations than they used to be. The home builders used to put 60,000 people at their annual convention, and they're wiped out now. So maybe the fact that these guys are smaller will get it taken, but I don't take that seriously.
Don't lose sleep over that.
Yeah.
I don't take it seriously. It's about $300 billion, by the way. If you look at the revenue loss from
Per
the
year.
non-taxation imputed rent, property tax, and mortgage interest, and then the non-taxation of the capital gain, if you happen to have one, it's about a $300 billion line item.
Wow. Thank you. Over here.
Good evening, my name is David Kelman. I'm a residential realtor in the area. One of the businesses I work with are first-time home buyers to step up buys, and my information is more anecdotal rather than the hard data like you have. I find that a lot of people are reluctant to purchase this time, partially because of fear of the market coming down, prices coming down, partially on foreclosure. There's also a certain concern of, am I going to be employed a year or two from now? And there's people increasing as they don't want to take a big step and buy. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak on those issues.
It's absolutely true. I mean, it's a big step. It's you're borrowing money. Other people are in trouble. Fear is in the marketplace. I think that'll gradually add. And as people are more successful, we're not seeing the mismatch of you need people with good credit, and you're not. So I think what you're going to see now is people who are very successful at buying and owning and staying in their houses. And as that starts to spread, I mean, it's too bad because people are going to be denied credit that could have had it a few years ago, but we gave it to a lot of people who really couldn't afford it. So it's a fine line, and it results in what we've seen creates a lot of fear. It's going to take some time to overcome that.
The other thing that I would add to that, in addition, I agree with all that Chip has said, but I think that, you know, it used to be that you could look at rough income levels and assume they weren't going to drop very much, and then if you compared that to housing prices, you get a sense about where you were in the market spiral. But I think one of the things that's going on now, it's not happening so much in Massachusetts, but if you look at areas like Detroit or Florida or Cleveland or Nevada, that values in the neighborhoods are dropping because of the numbers of foreclosures, right? So if I'm a person thinking in Detroit, thinking about buying, I'm really looking around and trying to figure out whether my neighborhood's going to exist in a couple of years. And if it doesn't, you know, what that's going to do to the value of my home. So I actually think that there are some externalities like that that are also beginning to impact people's decisions on these things.
By the way, it is true that we've tracked the last cycle almost step by step since the fall of '05. I mean, housing prices started to fall up here in actually '07. The fall of '07, housing prices fell, and they fell. No, it's fine.
November '05.
November '05, September, October, November '05.
Right.
It was '05. 06, 07, 08, 09, 10. It's been 5 years. And people have been watching that market and waiting for it to become accessible. And it's now they're starting to worry about missing the bottom. I believe that. But it's not mass numbers yet. I don't know when it will happen.
What's interesting, we've tracked this cycle against the old cycle using case shelter index.
So
And what's interesting is if you look at the cycle that began in '88, peaked in '88 in Greater Boston, came down, and it recovered, but not fully, until 1997, 9 years later.
Peak to trough decline was 14–15%.
Right, exactly the same, 14–15%. Took 42 months in both cycles to find a bottom. And if we track, and so far we're tracking almost right on top of the old cycle, we get back to the prices of November '05 in May of 2014.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Judy Potts, and I'm from Stoughton. I would like to know if you want to predict something about what's going to happen to prevent this from happening again. We talk about the housing bubble, and we talk about the what happened in the market, but there was something that nobody mentions that I was in the mortgage business for a long time, and I saw it happening. And there were people making money, creating mortgage loans for people who shouldn't have had them. There was no regulation. They came in with this computerized underwriting.
That's right.
And if you tweaked it enough, you could approve a gorilla for a house. And this is what happened to it. And we say, oh, Fannie, Freddie, this one, that one. They're a huge greed, guilt problem on the banks. And there were a couple of banks, of course, that I know of that Dime Savings Bank, for instance, in New York, went out of business doing what we call breathing loans, you know. They put a mirror under your nose, and if it fogged up, you could have a mortgage.
But the reason, part of the problem was the collateral that was there went away. And for a lot of years, we used to say, I didn't say this very loudly, but a lot of people said that this is a way of building wealth for people. As long as the collateral is there, the loans, you got an asset that was going to appreciate. It was a way, and by the way, that paper that looked so terrible at the end of the decade was profitable business at the early part of the decade because the collateral was always there. So those people who wrote I hate Desktop Underwriter and Loan Prospector, which are those machines that did the underwriting. They're crazy. But they analyzed the data correctly, and the paper that looked so bad when things was actually profitable business back in the early part of the decade. It seems mad, but the default rates were 3 or 4%, not 20 or 25 or 30, which they just left out one variable, that is house prices. And the minute house prices fell, it was a problem. But they
Details.
it was crazy times, and what'll prevent it, hopefully, is the fact that we lived through it. The problem this time is we had 30 years of rising house prices, and every time it went down for a little bit in New England or down for a little bit in California, it came roaring right back. So it's not surprising that you got sort of careless behavior of 30 years of luck in terms of the price of housing and the price of land. Now I have to say, I don't think you're going to see this happen again in housing. I think the standards are going to be tougher, but you never know, and it'll happen somewhere else.
I'm actually a touch more pessimistic than that on whether it will happen again. I mean, it seems to me that part of what happened is that people began to get this idea that structure trumped asset quality, right? And it just doesn't. And so there were lots and lots of loans. It's not just the underwriting systems, but there were lots and lots of no-doc loans, right? Yeah. And so in which you didn't really need to do anything except, as you say, breathe in order to get a loan. And I think that there was also disparate regulations, that you had some of the regulated banks who in fact couldn't make those loans, and then they would generate other kinds of side undertakings that could. But if you look, for example, at Sovereign Bank, right? I mean, when you looked at the share of the mortgage market that they had, it dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped because they were a regulated entity and they couldn't make those loans. They then took it on the other side, but in the sense that, you know, Wall Street then came along and said, well, geez, you know, too bad you guys couldn't do any of this stuff, but now I get these nice mortgage-backed securities. Wouldn't you like to buy them? And, you know, and so then they bought them and they lost on the investment side too, which is why we now have Santander as opposed to Sovereign. But, you know, there's a real disconnect between what the regulation was if you were actually a regulated financial entity and what the regulation that didn't exist, basically, if you were an unregulated financial entity. So having both kinds of actors in the market, I also think created a real dislocation. I mean, there's just a very fundamental piece about if incomes aren't rising, right, I don't know where you get rises in home prices that are sustainable. And that's the thing that we were seeing on the street. Incomes didn't rise, home prices skyrocketed. There is a disconnect there that inevitably comes home.
A lot of this is going to be resolved only when they figure out what to do with Fannie and Freddie. The problem right now is that 100% of the loans, virtually 100% of the loans being made are guaranteed by the federal government. The Fannie and Freddie own about $5 trillion, and the FHA insures a ton of it. There's private mortgage insurance that takes a little bit of it. But they've got to figure out how they're going to transfer this risk off of the government and onto the books of private mortgage insurance. I don't know who's going to hold it, but the federal government is, at the end of the day, is not going to bear all that risk. And that's the only reason mortgages are being written today. That's the other piece of what they're throwing at this, is FHA and the purchases of mortgage-backed securities by the Fed, and what Fannie and Freddie still own that hasn't been marked. That is going to be an enormous problem to sort out with a Congress that isn't going to be talking to itself. Right? So I mean, there's going to be big trade-offs, and that's the thing that you have to watch. That and the tax bill.
Can I throw in just one more question? One of the things that I have suspected, you talk about the price of real estate going up, is that there were lending institutions that actually created foreclosures. They said, we'll lend people money that they can't pay back, but we're going to get back a property that we can sell for more than we lent on it.
That was the whole industry.
I seriously suspect that that's what happened, and that's what's so scary.
I don't think they caused them on purpose, but that was the effect of it.
Yeah.
That they loaned the money, the building took it back, made profit on it.
Next.
My question's actually.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm David Bank. I'm an economist at HUD.
Thank you, David.
But my question's actually about Massachusetts, the longer run future of housing in Massachusetts, and this is getting in the area. So if we have 366,000 students, and in particular we have those graduate students who are holding the rental market relatively, keeping the rental market relatively strong in this area. The problem that I see is that those graduate students, once they graduate, don't necessarily want to stay in the rental market long term. And so I'm curious about what you see as the way to deal with affordability in Massachusetts when you have those graduate students who are coming out with more student debt than any generation before. And yes, prices have dropped, and that's helped affordability somewhat, but not to the point where recent graduate students with a student debt that is essentially, half a rent payment or half a mortgage every month can actually afford to buy homes and therefore stay in this area. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that for the longer term.
Either of you want to take a crack at that?
You've been thinking about the students a while.
Well,
I'm retired from students.
you're retired.
I don't know, I vote for a good dose of inflation, makes all those,
Well, that's what they-
makes
that's
all
what
those
they-
student, I know, makes all those student loans a whole lot cheaper to pay off in tomorrow's dollars.
Helicopter Ben seems to have the same idea.
I think, David, you raised an incredibly important point. I mean, part of what happened, of course, is the recession we had that began in December '07 certainly had to do with the collapse of the housing markets. But it actually also had to do with the fact that people were so in debt. The amount of indebtedness of the private sector, our external debt in terms of our balance of payments, and in federal debt, all of those things went through the roof. And so what you have now are people who really got scared by all this credit card debt they had, and what they're doing is now they're paying off debt. In fact, part of the reason why I'm relatively pessimistic about any short-term recovery in the economy is that even when you generate more income, it goes directly into savings and paying off credit card debt or home equity loans, rather than purchasing new stuff. And it's going to take a long time to unwind that, in the same way it's going to take a hell of a lot, long time to unwind the federal debt, as we heard from the bipartisan commission today. And in fact, probably 2/3 of what they want to do is politically dead on arrival. So I don't expect to see $4 trillion worth of savings in federal government spending between now and 2020. So I think what's going to happen is that people became, triply indebted. They got indebted for student loans. They became indebted off of their credit cards. And then if they were buying on the home market, they were in debt there. And I think we're going to probably go through a fairly long period of time while we unravel a lot of that to the point where we get to a new stable point. In terms of our housing market here, I've been arguing for a decade, so have many other people, that we are facing, and you've heard me say this for those of you in the class at the beginning of the semester, what I've been calling the third Civil War. The real thing, and we're going to be talking about it next semester, as many of you know, we're going to do a whole semester on demography as destiny. Part of that is looking at how the aging of our population is going to cause serious problems at the national level. It's going to cause particularly serious problems here in New England, where we are aging faster than the country. And part of that will be that we're going to have to find a way to keep young people here, because otherwise our population ages without a young workforce coming in their place, both to work and to pay taxes. The only way you do that is you've got to have a lot of things here that keep young people here rather than going to North Carolina or Oregon and Washington. Chief among those is affordable housing that they can put a family in. We're going to have to figure out new models of how to do that. Elise has thought about some of those models, so have other people. Shared equity, other kinds of ways of doing that. We need to build a lot more housing to get those prices down. We have to figure out how to get the land prices down. That's why we have laws like Chapter 40R and 40S, and thank God kept 40B, didn't repeal it. Those are beginnings, but we need to think of a lot more ways of doing that. We also, on top of that, I have to add, it's not just housing. We also have to have the amenities and the good schools, so people want to live in neighborhoods where they can send their kids to public school rather than private school. There's a lot of stuff we're going to have to do right over the next decade, and housing is one of them. And we're going to have to deal with a population that is heavily indebted to boot.
You know, we've been saying some awful negative stuff. I was just throw something out. I mean,
Patriots are gonna win next week.
no, I mean, if you go back to 80, 81, in 80, 81, Paul Volcker was chairman of the Fed,
Right?
and we elected Ronald Reagan. And Paul Volcker stepped on the brakes in the late 70s hard. And he said, we're going to let interest rates go up until we break the back of this inflation. So we had a 22.9% Fed funds rate. We now have a 0% Fed funds rate. And we had a 22.9% Fed funds rate in part because as soon as Reagan was elected, he passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 81, which was the biggest tax cut in the history of the country. And so we were driving the car with one foot on the brake, one foot on the accelerator. That screwed up the international currency markets big time because the Japanese were earning 0% in their savings at home. They could buy treasury bills from the United States and get paid 18%. My grandmother was in the money markets at that time. And she never put anything in the past but in passbook savings accounts. So if you look at those problems, you read Lester Thoreau wrote a book at that time, and he said, this is the end. We're done. We're cooked. The Asian tigers are going to take all our business. We've got the dollar is not buying anything. Toyotas look cheap to us, and because the dollar was so. I'm saying it backwards. The interest rates were so high that the dollar was overvalued, and we were buying Toyotas for half price. And if you read those books and you read what people were saying, it sounded a lot worse than what we got now. And somehow we got out of it. It came, you know, and everybody said, where are the jobs going to come from? New England back in the 70s was a nightmare. It was a complete nightmare. Jim Howe was writing these things in Massachusetts. And so it's just, we do live in a system that manages to surprise us every once in a while. And I think it's going to surprise us again eventually. It's just going to take some time. I couldn't help but say that.
I agree. I mean, we will come back. I mean, these are cycles. This happens to be a particularly bad one. But there are all kinds of things. I mean, one of the things that's going to help bring us back, something that I'm not totally excited about it, profits are at an all-time high. Ultimately, if some of those profits get reinvested in new plants, new equipment, hire more workers, that's one place where we're going to get some improvement. If we do get some inflation, it is going to make some of this debt a little cheaper, including the federal debt. So there are a lot of things that could happen, and it's amazing when they do happen in retrospect. But right now, it's very hard to see real great improvement over the next 6 months to a year or more. You know.
I'm with you. I mean, it's
Over here. Who are you?
Andrew Caravan, and I work for Madison Park Development Corporation. And the group of us came over here a little bit more about affordable rental housing.
Yeah.
What policy changes or structures do you see needed in the servicing of mortgages? And I assume you need to get a mortgage broker's license in Massachusetts, and maybe what policy advice would you give to the governor about changing that to make it easier for us to deal with this situation, so that we don't have originations that are just totally not tied to the mortgage whatsoever.
Well,
To either one of you.
you do, of course, need a mortgage broker's license, which I think is a good thing. I think the critical piece is that writing a mortgage without appropriate underwriting, to my mind, in the long term, is a recipe for disaster. Now, you can talk about what that underwriting looks like, right? I mean, one of the challenges, if folks have been through foreclosure or they've been through serious default on their mortgages, they've got a really negative credit score, and so you don't really want to keep all those folks out of the marketplace. So I actually think we may have to do some more hands-on kinds of underwriting for a while, in which you take a look at some other things. You look at what's happened to debt during a period of time which people weren't paying their mortgage. Were they able to take those funds and pay down other debt? You look at the ability to pay utility bills or get your kids through school, whatever. There are a whole lot of surrogates around. I mean, credit score has got to be an easy thing, right? It was a number you would look at it, that was it. That's not going to work so well right now, I think. But in fact, I do think that hands-on underwriting and hands-on servicing is really going to be key for moving the process forward. And the other thing, as I indicated earlier when I was speaking, is that the set of incentives for servicers really needs to align much more closely with the set of incentives for homeowners. Servicers need to have skin in the game. I'm not just talking the bottom 10% like a country going in, but they really need, if in fact mortgages aren't being paid, then there needs to be a process whereby they are encouraged to clear the debts very, very quickly. One of the great challenges is from the moment that somebody goes into default until the moment that the foreclosure is actually completed can be in the nature of 400 or 500 days, right? So you're really talking about a mortgage that hasn't been paid for 12 months, 18 months. And part of the challenge is getting people back in the habit of paying regularly on a mortgage after they haven't paid for that period of time, even if they've been terrifically responsible, paid down remaining debt and so forth. That's a big shift of behavior. So I think that there do need to be some changes to regulation to require that foreclosures proceed very, very quickly if they're real and if they've been based on appropriate underwriting, so there isn't this kind of long period of sort of a shadow going on.
You know, the secondary market and even the mortgage-backed securities market, the tranche stuff, was a good idea. It was a good idea because it got supposedly risky paper in the hands of people who wanted to take risks. Provided a way in which money was made available to the mortgage market. But what it did was it meant that a lot of people have their hands on this thing, and it can be blocked in so many ways. The complexity of who's got what piece of paper is unbelievable, and there's unfortunately not much equity left in these products. So they're scrapping over little bits of money with a lot of people, and it just seems to me there ought to be a way to cram those things through and get. And I think we were starting to do that when this mortgage mess blew up. This latest thing with the improperly prepared mortgages, and I thought we were on a roll early in the summer with getting the flow moving, but it's now stopped dead, and I don't know how that's going to come out. We haven't talked about that at all.
Right. Let me go to one of the points you raised, which was about affordable rental. There are a lot of answers to that, but the answer that I have been promoting, and you'll hear me promoting it more, is to get universities and developers working together to take some pressure off the student market. And so I have been talking about, and it's been written up a little bit, of getting universities working together to create what I call multi-university graduate student villages. Could have them in a number of places where you get, Northeastern, which is at 4,400 more graduate students today than 10 years ago. It's terrific. We have actually fewer undergraduates, but 4,400 more graduate students. And we're going to have many more over time. So will BU, so will most of these universities. We house very few of them, as I said. What would happen if you got these universities together, working with a very good developer or developers, working with a good construction company, working with groups like Mass Development and others, to see what could be done to put together a real graduate student village that would appeal not only to students when they're graduate students, but also give them the opportunity to stay there for, let's say, 5 years after they graduate. Really put down some roots here, really become part of Red Sox Nation. Universities would be responsible for marketing it aggressively, get their graduate students in. The developers would be responsible for putting it up. It would stay on the tax rolls, although we might be able to get some tax abatement for it because it's better than having it roll off the tax rolls. There's some real exciting ways of doing that, and that will take some pressure off there. Then you have to ask the question, well, what can we do for low-income families who aren't students? And we need some models of that. Elise has been thinking about, a lot of other people have. But I think we need to continue, despite the fact that we don't talk about the exploding double-digit appreciation. We still have a serious affordability problem, and we need some new answers to it. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Mr. Culver?
I'm Bob Culver from Mass Development. Chip, I don't want to talk about the state stuff right now. I want to talk about the thoughts of a very good economist now retired. Has economics as we know it fail. You would have taught, I would have listened. The notion that price clears all markets would have been what we would have been taught. We would have been taught that a liquidity crisis can virtually never happen. You know, Francis Battor told me it could never happen. You know, these things could never happen. But yet all of this is happening. And with all great respect, what we get from the economists today, as I read voraciously to try to find out answers for Massachusetts, is that we're just going to have to wait. And then the question comes, are you telling me therefore that the notions of fiscal and monetary policy as we have developed them since the Second World War really don't work? And I think there's a lot of people that are quite confused. And then we get to your issue, our issue of Fannie and Freddie. And the only answer I can come up with, being a sort of curmudgeonly old CFO type, is a structured bankruptcy to try to get the markets working, but nobody is willing to say, yeah, that's what we need to do.
Well, I not to be defensive,
I
but I spent 25, 30 years studying the market failure. I mean, what Bob Shore and I wrote about back in 1985 was the economics of a particular kind of market failure called a bubble. Paul Samuelson Samuelson invented most of economics. And he wrote brilliantly in a 57 piece on speculation.
You might have wanted to listen to Schumpeter a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. But so it's not, I mean, the profession is very broad. But I mean, so he said in that, Samuelson said in that piece that in all the arsenal of economic theory, there was nothing that tells you that a bubble will burst in X amount of time, and it's just not there. And he said he's surprised by it, puzzled by it. And a lot of us have been thinking about that, and it doesn't seem to be an answer. If you believe an asset's going to go up in value, you're willing to pay more for it. And if that gets expressed in the market and expectations are backward looking, you're off to the races. And it takes something to stop that from occurring, and it happened big time. It was complicated by the structure of the financial markets. I don't think that makes economics wrong, but then there's macro, right? I always hated macro because I never quite understood it. It took Keynes. Keynes spent a lot of time thinking about it, and people wrote just massive amounts about the work of Keynes. And I've never believed that you can fine-tune the economy. And you trade off a lot. You go to the market because you believe the market's going to provide a ticket to getting the best kind of allocation you can get, subject to things that fail. I mean, we don't do a good job with the environment. We don't do a good job with bubbles. We've never done a good job with those things. And we've had to deal with them. And people have argued for doing it. And at the same time, there's this notion out there that I don't believe in, that markets solve all problems. They don't solve all problems. They create some problems. And so you need a mixed economy. The result with purely planned economy stinks. Right? You look at what happened in the economies that tried to do it without the market. I went down to spend some time going back and forth to Cuba. In fact, I spent 3 hours being interrogated because I had notes on financial markets in my suitcase. But if you try to do it without the market, it fails. If you do it with the market, economists have spent a lot of time diagnosing and coming up with treatments for market failure. But I don't think I ever expected economists to be gods. You're dealing in this country with 300 million people banging into each other. It's going to be messy.
I wasn't meaning to imply that economists were God or that you live up to that standard.
But you got big problems. You want people to worry about.
But you would suggest that big solutions are necessary now.
Well, macroeconomics is a mess. You're right about that. I mean, we're monetary policy and fiscal policy, and the old way we used to think about macro as being confined to sort of a few rules, and you do this when you got excess capacity, and you do this to get investment going. Those days are gone, and we now have ourselves at a time when we have to think about the macro economy anew, and I think we're doing it. But I don't think we've come up with any answers yet. many answers.
You know, I'd like to add just one counterpoint to that. I'm not budging, I'm not going anywhere near that. But it's just, but I just want to say
That's where the fun is.
one other thing about housing. Housing isn't just a market, right? It's really not just about the economy. It's the place where all of us live. It's the place where we raise families. It's the place where we grow old and die. It's what makes up our communities. And in some respects, I think that's really what makes this bubble different from any other bubble, right? When the internet went up, the internet came back down. There were lots of individual companies and so on that had a big economic impact. But it didn't impact the places that people live. It didn't impact where they went to do their grocery shopping. It didn't impact the dry cleaner. This is really quite different. And I think in many respects in the last almost 50 years, we've lost track of housing as something other than a market, something other than a financial tool, right? It really is the thing on which the country is built in terms of where people live. And I think that as we move forward and try and sort these solutions out, we can't lose track of that. If we simply think of this as a house, as another financial instrument, we're not going to come up with a solution that actually serves all of the people in the country.
So, quick response. Housing is consumer durable. We don't think of it as that. We think of it as a capital gain generating money machine, right? That's terrible. But I would say if we got back to thinking about housing as a consumer durable good, we don't have to, I mean, food gets into problems as well. The economy exists to make people live better lives. That's what its function is to take the resources we have and turn it into stuff we want. Some people want housing, some people want bluegrass music, some people want to play golf, some people can't feed the, so I believe that the economic problem is really huge. And we don't treat anything like it should be treated as something that satisfies human wants, needs. The purpose of the economy is to do that. So I think we got away from it more in housing than we had in any other commodity that I remember, where it became a tool of you know, just a capital gains generating machine and not a consumer durable. But just getting us back to consumer durable doesn't have to get us into other disciplines.
But you know, my last point, Barbara, to Elise's point, in another life, I was the CFO of a Fortune 100 company, and I'm sitting in Europe, I'm sitting in Paris, and I'm cutting the living daylights out of factories and costs and everything else. And the man who ran the business in Europe, Frenchman, said to me, you know, well, you need to understand I will do whatever you Americans want. But you know, you really need to learn to figure out whether you live to work or you work to live. And in the discussion that you just had about what is housing, we in the United States of America, I mean, housing is all about capital accumulation, investment, and the like. There is no value statement that occurs in housing in terms of creating society, and that there is some, you know, pure public good that's involved, and how that should be valued. And I'm here. I'm willing to play economics. That's the easy side of this. But once you start to put a pure public good value in it, then we come into this question, which I have to deal with every day in my current job, of how much do we invest to in fact deal with the capital that was acquired in this housing gorge, the gorging that occurred with the markets, to in fact allow to clear the market and to establish a market now for housing. And who pays for that discounting, and how do markets work to make that happen? Sorry.
Well, part of the question is who's paying for it today?
Yeah.
Right?
It's what's not getting on the table in these negotiations about individual. If you put it on the table with some force, these things would get through. There's also interesting, Paul Salmon, who works for public broadcasting, he does a lot of stuff on PBS. He's doing a series right now on the ethics of all this. And it's, public goods is in there. It's going to be terrific. So you should watch for that. It's going to be terrific.
Very good. I want to thank our guests. Next week, we actually actually talk about real problems. I mean, this was just about housing, the economy. We're gonna talk about whether we're gonna broil to death or we're all gonna drown when the seas rise. So this is what we do next week with,
It should correctly say environment and energy.
and energy issues. Joan Fitzgerald from our university, Jim Hunt, who's the chief environmental guy for the mayor, and Craig Altamosa, who's executive director for Students for a Just and Stable Future. See you here next week, same place, same station, same time. Take care.